Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Thursday, January 27th. Here's some of what we're talking about tonight. President Biden formally announces Justice Stephen Breyer's retirement. The justice used the occasion to highlight his faith in our democracy.
My grandchildren and their children, they'll determine whether the experiment still works. And of course, I'm an optimist, and I'm pretty sure it will.
We'll get into what happens now, especially since the president promised to nominate a black woman to the court. Today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We'll take stock of the ongoing fight against anti-Semitism here in the U.S. Plus, we'll get into a cold case of the Holocaust. Who betrayed Anne Frank to the Nazis? The author of a new book on the case joins us ahead. And Neil Young may have left Spotify, but the world of streaming music is expanding. We'll see how these apps are reshaping the industry and show you who pays artists the most. All right, my friends, let us begin tonight with the fight against anti-Semitism. Today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We remember this history in part to prevent Jews from being targeted again. That work has a long way to go. Just 2 weeks ago, police responded to a hostage crisis at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, that's just outside Fort Worth. This Tuesday, federal prosecutors arrested the man who sold the firearm that was used to kidnap those hostages. Henry Michael Williams faces charges of being a felon in possession of a firearm. The FBI is treating this attack as a terrorist act and a hate crime. Meanwhile, Miami Beach is investigating flyers found on Sunday outside hundreds of homes. Some flyers lay out conspiracy theories about Jews profiting from COVID. Others refer to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's an anti-Semitic publication whose lies inspired Hitler himself. Similar packages were found in Denver and San Francisco. Jews face uniquely high threats in this country. They're only 2% of the U.S. population, but recent FBI figures show more than half of all religious bias crimes targeted Jews, more than half. According to the American Jewish Committee, nearly 1 in 4 American Jews say they faced anti-Semitism over the past year. Today serves as a reminder of what can happen if this kind of hatred takes root. On this date in 1945, soldiers liberated the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Today, commemorations took place in person and online. The UN Secretary General drew a parallel between the Holocaust and the crimes we're seeing today.
The phrase "never again" rings hollow unless we use the past to take the measure of our own time. What we see today must worry us and jolt us into action. A resurgence of Holocaust denial, attempts to rewrite history, efforts to whitewash and rehabilitate people who committed crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, survey after survey shows increasing ignorance among young people about basic facts of the Holocaust. Anti-Semitic attacks, both verbal and physical, have increased during the pandemic despite lockdowns and quarantines.
Let's begin tonight with Holly Huffnagel. She's the U.S. Director for Combating Anti-Semitism at the American Jewish Committee. Ms. Huffnagel, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
How do you see the fight against anti-Semitism today? Are we, generally speaking, making forward progress? Are we moving back? I'm sure it's a mix of both, but generally speaking, how are we doing?
It is a mix of both. I work on combating anti-Semitism every day. Unfortunately, in the past 5 years, anti-Semitism in our country has increased. We have FBI data to corroborate this. American Jewish Committee has actually done a study on American Jews and their experiences with and perceptions of anti-Semitism. And we can look to the incidents that have happened in the last few years, from what happened in Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, most recently in Colleyville, to show us that anti-Semitism is increasing. And so that part's not good. But the part that is good is we're raising awareness. We're making more people aware of what anti-Semitism is, how to call it out, giving resources to law enforcement to better protect the Jewish community. Congress is working toward passing legislation to better fund hate crimes reporting. So there is some hope in this fight as well.
We mentioned that statistic earlier where nearly 1 in 4 American Jews say they experienced anti-Semitism over the past year. Also, 39% of American Jews say they've changed their behavior over the past 12 months. to avoid anti-Semitism. Can you drill down into that statistic for me a bit? What do those behavioral changes look like?
Absolutely. So what that 39% number means, it's about 3 behaviors we asked about. So 17% have actually avoided going to the Jewish institutions or going to some place that they might be associated with being Jewish. 22% have actually avoided wearing things that might identify them as Jewish, such as a kippah on their head or a Star of David necklace. And almost 25%, 1 in 4 American Jews have avoided posting content online that would identify them as Jewish. And so some people have chosen more than one of these things in the last year. That's where we get that 4 in 10 number have changed behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. The one thing that's really important to note is that that number jumps to 52% for young American Jews. Over half of young American Jews between the ages of 18 and 29 have had these behavioral changes. And that's the future generation. And so that's a little more frightening.
I wonder what you think is behind all of this. I mean, it seems like some of these incidents are people who are deeply motivated by real, virulent anti-Semitism. Some of them seem to be motivated, depending on the situation, the circumstances, and who's involved, by people who are just trying to be provocative. They know that, like, scrawling a swastika somewhere will get a rise out of people, and so they do it just to be jerks, really, to be terrible. How do we get at what's underneath this? The events that are more hooliganism and rudeness and stupidity versus the ones that pose like a real tangible physical threat?
Obviously, the ones that pose a real tangible, physical threat, need to be confronted with immediacy, need to be called out. We need to protect and save Jewish life. But at the same time, we can't dismiss the swastika in the bathroom. Americans need to know that that's also not okay. There's no room for this kind of hatred and vitriol in our society. Might start with that swastika on the bathroom or a comment online or a flyer, on someone's driveway can lead to real life harm against Jews. And so we really do need to call it out no matter its source.
In a way, I feel like, you look at things like the flyers we just showed, the one that Miami Beach's Mayor Dan Gelber tweeted out, that has a list of people that it says are all part of some Jewish conspiracy to profit from COVID. I mean, even things like that, which, by the way, it lists Javier Becerra, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He's Roman Catholic. But even things like that seem to almost be more insidious because they kind of create this environment where the steady drip of all these images and messages can kind of take root in someone's mind and then metastasize into something worse. What do we do about something like this? Other than the law enforcement investigations, what do you think is our strongest offense against anti-Semitism these days?
I actually think the strongest offense is going to be civil society. I mean, our government needs to do its part. There are leaders, law enforcement needs to do their part, but civil society needs to, kind of rise up and say, there's no place for this kind of hatred, in our country. And usually the reason why anti-Semitism is rising, it's usually a sign of, something else is wrong, whether it be our eroding of our democracy, the deep polarization, the politicization in our country. And so having civil society, come up and come forth and call this out, push those anti-Semites to the fringes, under the rocks, where they belong, that's what we need.
And for those people who, may be willing to help, but, I'm sure there are plenty of people watching right now who say, yeah, if I saw something, heard something, encountered something, I'd speak up immediately. Absent that, I don't know what to do. Is there anything proactive that you would like for people to do more of, do less of, do differently to try to reduce anti-Semitism before we go?
So anti-Semitism is actually not a Jewish problem. It shouldn't be up to the hated to fight the hate or the victim to fight the crime. So it's really up to non-Jews, to all of us to be part of this. An important place to start is ajc.org. That stands for American Jewish Committee, ajc.org. We have resources on how to get involved, what to do. But when you see something, say something, report anti-Semitism, listen to the needs of the Jewish community. Where can, you help engage in your local efforts? And I think that's where it will start.
I really appreciate what you said in terms of the way forward, that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's everyone else's problem. We're the ones who need to create the environment where anti-Semitism cannot thrive. I will hang on to that. Holly Huff-Nagel from the American Jewish Committee, I really appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come, the story of Holocaust victim Anne Frank is getting a new chapter, not from her, but from cold case investigators answering a vital question. Who betrayed Anne Frank? We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. It is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a time to shape the future by honoring the past. One of the best-known stories from this genocide is getting some new details. The story of Anne Frank. On August 4th, 1944, Nazis arrested Anne Frank and her family. The Nazis got a tip that they were there, but who tipped them off? The Frank family was hiding with 4 other Jews for more than 2 years. They were hidden behind Otto Frank's warehouse in Amsterdam in what came to be known as the Annex. 15-year-old Anne Frank, her mother and sister all died at the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen. Only Otto Frank survived. The Netherlands turned out to be especially deadly for Jews during the war. More than 3/4 of its Jewish population was killed. Anne Frank's diary survived the Nazi raid, and her father published it in 1947.
And after I had the news that my children would not come back, Miep gave me the diary, which had been saved by, I should say, a miracle. It took me a very long time to read it. And I must say, I was very much surprised about deep thoughts Anne had, seriousness, especially her self-criticism. It was quite a different Anne I had known as my daughter.
Anne Frank's story is remarkable, but it's been missing an ending. How did the Nazis know that the Frank family was in the Annex? 2 investigations have come up empty, but in 2016, a cold case team assembled in Amsterdam to try again. Their work is the focus of the new book, The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a cold case investigation. And joining us now is its author, Rosemary Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
So we mentioned there were 2 investigations, one from 1947 to 48, one from 1963 to 64. What changed in 2016 to prompt the investigation that you write about?
Well, it was initiated by 2 Dutchmen, by Thijs Bayens, a filmmaker, and Peter van Pusk, a historian and journalist. They both felt that the shift towards the extreme right and ideological divisiveness that was occurring not only in the Netherlands, but in Europe and perhaps North America, called for some kind of response. And both of them thought that if we could take up the case again of Anne Frank and her family, that would be a remarkable route to reminding people of how terrible things can be.
How much did they have to dig through in order to find the answers they were looking for? Was it just a matter of digging through documentation that was in an archive somewhere, or did they have to go back to the Annex and basically treat it like a crime scene?
The whole 9 yards. Vince, Thijs and Peter decided that they needed an outsider to lead the investigation, someone who wasn't Dutch. So they approached the FBI retired special agent Vince Pankow to ask if he would lead the investigation, and he agreed. Vince brought the specializations of an FBI investigator to the case. First of all, he decided that there would be, on the one hand, the search for historical documents, but on the other hand, they were going to use artificial intelligence to draw connections that hadn't been made before. So they were able to get a Dutch company, to a database company, to collect all the material they themselves had drawn from archives. There was a point where there were 23 people working on this case, and they had something like 4,500 files, 66 gigabytes of material, of data, and they loaded that onto an AI platform and were able to draw connections between who was on raids together, which Dutch policemen with which Nazis, who lived near each other, addresses, the things that had slipped away before.
And what did they find? I mean, do we now know who betrayed the Frank family to the Nazis, or does that remain an open question?
They were able to come up with 30 potential scenarios. And of those 30 scenarios, they were able to on about 12 plus suspects. And Vince applied the FBI strategy of knowledge, motive, and opportunity to each of these cases. And then it got down to about 4 cases that we were going to look at. In the end, it became obvious that the most likely candidate was a man who was called Arnold Vandenberg. The reason he was important as a suspect was that when Otto Frank returned from Auschwitz, the only member of his family to survive, as you said, he found an anonymous note among his papers. The anonymous note said, "Your address was betrayed to the SD by Arnold Vandenberg. Other addresses were also given to the SD." This name of Arnold Vandenberg and the anonymous note had been mentioned briefly in a biography of Otto Frank by Carol Ann Lee and a couple of other places, but it hadn't been looked at in detail. Vince, with the instincts of an FBI investigator, decided he had to look for this. And in the 1963 investigation that was conducted by Detective Van Helden, he read the 120-page report, and there was a reference to the anonymous note, but there was no anonymous note. The reference was that Otto Frank had given him this note. So Vince then went to look for the son of Van Helden, whom he was able to find, who had papers that his father had left behind after he died, and one of them was this anonymous note. Now, the anonymous note was a copy, so Otto Frank told the detective, that he had made, having given the original to a friend who was a notary. Vince took this anonymous note and had it tested. They went and checked the typeface, the way in which the letters were distributed on the page. They asked a young woman called Kara, who had a long correspondence with Otto Frank, for copies of her letters, and the typeface expert was able to conclude that this anonymous note written in 1957 was actually the copy made on Otto Frank's typewriter. Okay, so you have an anonymous note. But then what's very bizarre and curious about the investigation is the discovery. What Vince did was he had various projects. He had the mapping project, the resident project, the statement project. And in the statement project, he found statements by Mietke saying that both she and Otto Frank knew who the betrayer was. There was a very funny moment when she said to her friend, poor Silk. Sorry?
I'm sorry to have to interrupt you. I know we have to move on. This is a fascinating cold case, and I think that from having begun to read it, I think it's kind of a primer on what happened to Anne Frank. For those who don't know, by the way, the SD was a Nazi unit that had basically a Jew hunting unit that was part of their job, and also some of the social forces that got in the way of the investigation, and that may yet still kind of impede the process of moving forward from here. But it is a fascinating story, and the book is called The Betrayal of Anne Frank, A Cold Case Investigation. Rosemary Sullivan, I appreciate you making time for us. Thank you very much. Coming up, one of President Biden's campaign promises is about to come due. He said that he would nominate the first black woman to the Supreme Court. We will lay out the vetting process and who we think is on the short list. Just ahead. Stay close. Well, it's official. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is indeed retiring. He said so today at an announcement alongside President Biden. Justice Breyer leaves at a time when many Americans are expressing some pessimism about the nation's future. During his announcement, he reminded us that America is an experiment in liberty, and the experiment is not over.
I'm talking to the students now. I say, I want you to pick just this up. It's an experiment that's still going on. And I'll tell you something. You know who will see whether that experiment works? It's you, my friend. It's you, Mr. High School student. It's you, Mr. College student. It's you, Mr. Law School students. It's us, but it's you. It's that next generation and the one after that. My grandchildren and their children. They'll determine whether the experiment still works. And of course, I am an optimist, and I'm pretty sure it will.
Me too. So, how does this process work from here? And who's on the president's shortlist? Let's answer that first question about the process with NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Hey, Kelly.
Good evening, Joshua. It seems that in an instant there is a new power center inside the White House, and that is the search committee for a Supreme Court nominee. Now, the White House had some inkling ahead of the public knowing that Justice Breyer would be stepping down, but generally speaking, there wasn't wide expectation of a coming vacancy. But behind the scenes, the White House is always ready for a potential vacancy. We've seen at times in recent years when that would come by death or retirement. So there's always a working list going on for potential names who would be appointed for seats on the federal bench, and in this case, a seat on the Supreme Court. So there is already a lot of work that has been done, and it will amp up significantly. The president has laid out a timeline. He would like to have a selection made by the end of February. That's important for a couple of key reasons. The timing of what Congress needs to do, and it's also important because he has a very big speech, the State of the Union, set for March 1st. And so he will be able to announce his pick, a historic pick, the first African-American woman nominated to the Supreme Court, before he addresses that joint session of Congress and the nation. So that will be a highlight moment. Between now and then, the president says he wants to confer with members of both parties in the Senate, and that really goes right to the Constitution and the role senators are given to advise and give consent to a nominee offered by the president. So look for some outreach to Republicans as well as Democrats, and then all of the interest groups who often play a very outsized role in nominations, and the fight on the right and on the left about who should get this position and what issues will come up. Part of what we'll be seeing is the vetting process. Now, we expect that the president will choose from perhaps a current sitting judge, maybe even one he appointed to the federal bench, so they would have all the records on that person's track record, resume, personal history, and so forth. But one of the things that comes up at this level would be past speeches, other writings, things that might get attention in a new way. That's where a lot of the scrutiny will be. And then, of course, there will be personal interviews for finalists. So it will be an intense month-long, about in that range, period for the president and the people on his team making this decision. And then it goes to the real work of the Senate to try to get this done in a timely way. Joshua?
Thank you, Kelly. That was NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, and she alluded to the big question on everyone's minds. Obviously, who's on the president's shortlist? Well, some folks consider one woman in particular a top contender to succeed Justice Breyer. Here's NBC senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor.
With the news that Justice Stephen Breyer will retire, all eyes are on who will fill his seat. President Biden has promised to nominate the first black woman to the Supreme Court.
The president has stated and reiterated his commitment to nominating black women to the Supreme Court and certainly stands by that.
Among his likely shortlisters, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Here's all you need to know about the woman considered a frontrunner for the Supreme Court nomination. Jackson is a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, a prestigious federal panel with many recognizable names. She was confirmed last summer after President Biden nominated her.
It is an honor to appear before you all this morning.
Born in D.C., she grew up in Miami and then attended Harvard College, where she says she was once Matt Damon's scene partner for a class.
As a side note, although I was pretty good, I doubt he'd remember me now.
After graduating from Harvard Law School, she paved out a steady legal career. at one point clerking for Breyer himself.
And even today, I feel so lucky to have had the chance to work inside an institution that has such a significant impact on the lives of Americans, and that few people even get to see, much less to be a part of.
Eventually serving as the vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Sentencing Commission, before becoming a federal district judge in D.C. Fun fact, former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who she is related to by marriage, testified in support. And while in that role, she made headlines in 2019 when she ruled that former White House counsel Don McGahn must obey a subpoena to testify to Congress following the Mueller report, writing that, quote, "Presidents are not kings." And now, she is likely on the shortlist for the president's Supreme Court pick. At 51, she's young enough to hold the seat for decades. Her background and rulings have drawn praise. And just last summer, she won a vote of confidence from Biden and the Senate when all Democrats and 3 Republicans confirmed her as an appeals judge.
That was NBC's Sahil Kapoor reporting. Coming up, the SAT is going digital. The nonprofit behind the test says the change will help students. Critics say it's time to drop standardized tests altogether. Decide for yourself after you hear from both sides when we come back. High schools may need a lot fewer number 2 pencils, at least around SAT time. This standardized test is going digital. That news came this week from the College Board, the nonprofit that administers the SAT. Starting in 2024, all students in the U.S. will take the test on a computer or tablet, if they choose to take it, of course. Other countries will make the shift as early as next year. The College Board says this decision should, among other things, make the SAT less stressful. In a statement, it says a digital test can do things that a paper test cannot. The group added that it's adapting to input from students and educators to, quote, ensure we continue to meet their evolving needs, unquote. Now, the SAT does not predict success or potential, granted, 1380, thank you. But critics say these tests amplify inequities that put students of color at disadvantages. If I had not tested that well, and the college admissions officers had a different view of me, would I be sitting here tonight? More schools are moving away from standardized tests. This March, the trust will vote on permanently dropping its standardized test requirements. According to the LA Times, none of the trustees opposed the idea at yesterday's board meeting. According to the advocacy group Fair Test, more than 1,800 colleges and universities have dropped this requirement for 2022 admissions. That group's executive director joins us in just a moment. Some schools have made a temporary change, citing the pandemic as a reason. Harvard is dropping the test requirement through 2026. The University of California system dropped it altogether. So how will this new SAT format affect students as they step into adulthood? And how do we decide whether to use these tests at all? Joining me now is Priscilla Rodriguez, Vice President of College Readiness Assessments for the College Board. Ms. Rodriguez, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dig a little bit more into the rationale behind making some of these changes. It sounds like, at least according to what the College Board has said, the goal was to sort of keep up with the times.
That was definitely part of it. So students are doing, as we know, much of their living and more of their learning and testing digitally. So certainly part of this was, in some ways, catching up with where students are and where schools are increasingly. The other part of it is, we've been listening to the feedback from students and educators about what it's like to take the SAT. And there were changes that we couldn't make, benefits we couldn't deliver to students and educators if we stayed a paper and pencil test that millions of students have to take that has to stay really secure but get shipped around the world. And so as we make this transition to an all-digital SAT, there are a lot of changes, and really I view them as benefits that we're going to be able to deliver to students and educators that they've long wanted, but we couldn't deliver.
Dig a little deeper into the things that are going to change and the things that are not going to change.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll start with what's not changing, because I think I really want students and families to feel comfortable and confident about what's staying the same. So the first is the digital SAT will measure the same core reading, writing, and math skills that they're learning in high school and that the current SAT measures and research shows matters for career and college. The score scale is staying the same. So the SAT will still be scored on a 1,600-point scale. Students will still take the digital SAT either in their school or at a school on the weekend. This is not an at-home SAT. And then students who take the SAT or the PSAT, for that matter, are going to be able to connect to scholarships, which we know make a huge difference for many students and families. And we're continuing our partnership with another nonprofit called Khan Academy to continue to deliver free world-class practice resources online for the digital SAT.
You said this is not an at-home you did say that this was not an at-home SAT, which gets at what I was going to ask you next, which was keeping it secure. I thought that was the point of having to go to a place to take the SAT, but since it becomes digital, how do you prevent cheating?
Yeah, that's another big benefit of the changes we're making. Right now, when students take the SAT on a given day, regardless of what school they're sitting in or actually what country they're in, they're taking the same version of the test, right? We have to print out these paper tests and, like I said, ship them around the world. We have really rigorous security protocols, many of which we don't talk about, but still, a test can get compromised, and that can have real impact on other students taking the test that day. With this move to digital, we're actually going to be able to deliver a unique version of the test, meaning unique questions on the test, to every student. So that means, first off, there's no benefit to looking at what your neighbor's doing, and also it means we can be way more flexible in how, where, and when schools give the SAT. So it'll be on their terms and their schedule, not on our currently very rigid schedule.
I want to be clear I understand what you just said. You're still going to test the same subjects, but the questions that assess my knowledge within each subject may be different from the student to my left and to my right. Same general area of knowledge, but we'll be answering different questions to test that knowledge. Do I have that right?
That's perfectly said. So I think the best example to explain it is in math, though the same will be true in the reading writing section. But you and I will get tested on exactly the same math skills and knowledge, to your point. But you're going to have a math problem, let's say an algebra problem, that has the numbers 16, 14, and 72 in there, right? And you're solving for X. Well, right. I have to solve for X too. It's the same skill, but my numbers are 103 and 40 and 7. So it's we're testing the same thing, but you and I have two different math problems that are going to get two different answers. We cannot help each other, even if we wanted to.
How does the College Board respond to some of the schools that have decided to either make standardized tests optional rather than required, or do away with standardized tests altogether? I mean, Cal State is considering permanently dropping it. Iowa's universities have changed their rules. Harvard has changed its rules. Are there things that the College Board has contemplated doing to try to win them back, or are you letting them go?
So as you know, many colleges and universities went what's called test optional over the last 2 years as a direct response to COVID, and it was absolutely the right thing to do for students. There's no question about that. But where we are now, what we're focused on with the digital SAT is making the SAT the best possible option for students. So that's about it being shorter, which it will be, 2 hours instead of 3, more flexible, as I spoke about. Faster scores coming back, because now we're scoring digitally, not on these Scantron sheets. There's this range of benefits, and we really want to make it a test, as it is, of core reading, writing, and math skills without a lot of the stress around it. We did a pilot globally a few months ago with students with the digital SAT. 80% of them told us that it was less stressful than the current SAT. So best option possible. That's really what we're focused on. I will say, colleges and universities are making their choices as they should. But we believe, and we are hearing from students, that preserving their option, their right to choose what they put on their college application, is really important. We've been surveying students regularly for the last 2 years. We ask them tons of questions. They often don't know the surveys from us, so they're called blind surveys. And they're consistently, over 80% of students are consistently telling us they want the option to put a test score there. Doesn't mean they're going to, but they want to make that choice. And we think that option is really important. And we think it's a decision best made by a student and their family, so that they can decide if they feel like the SAT shows their strengths and can show what they know.
And I know I've got to let you go in a second, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the concerns about racial inequities in standardized tests. What is the College Board doing or plan to do to try to win back some trust with people who believe that tests like this are inherently unfair, inherently inequitable, no matter how you structure them?
Where I want to start is where I think a lot of this does start, which is there are deep inequities in K-12 in this country. Those inequities come to light in all standardized measures, the SAT, any other standardized test. Our perspective is that we collectively have the best chance of naming and fixing those inequities if we can see them. And where we come in with the SAT in particular is we want it to be a test that's available to any student who wants it. It used to be that you could only take it if you signed up on a Saturday, right, and you or your parents drove you there. Now 60% of students take the SAT in their school building during the school day, free of charge to them. Their school, district, or state pays for it. That has been huge for access and equity, and research shows, third-party, independent research has shown over 7 or 10 years now that it changes college-going rates in the schools that bring it to all their students during the school day for free, including for underrepresented and low-income students. I am both of those. I'm Latina. My parents immigrated to the U.S. with very little financially. The SAT changed my life. If it were only me, it wouldn't matter. That'd just be a nice story. But it's millions of students every year. So in the high school class of 2020, as an example, here in the U.S., 1.7 million students who took the SAT in that class got a score that either matched their high school GPA, which is a great thing to show a college, especially when we have 25,000 high schools, all with their own grading system, or even exceeded their high school GPA, stronger than their high school GPA, right? Really shows their strength. In that 1.7 million students were 300,000 who are from rural communities or small towns, 600,000 who were first-gen college goers in their family, and 700,000 who were Black or Latino. So regardless of background, and especially for students who go to the high schools that the colleges don't all know and come visit, that was like mine, the SAT can help you show what you know, what you can do, and now you have the choice if you want to submit it or not. And we just want to be there as a great choice for any student who wants it.
Priscilla Rodriguez of the College Board, I appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's continue now with Bob Schaefer. He's the executive director of Fair Test. In a recent statement, he said that moving to a digital SAT is a, quote, College Board marketing ploy, not a fairer, more accurate admission tool, unquote. Mr. Schaefer, welcome.
Thank you.
Could we start with where we left off in that last conversation and her remark about equity and how standardized testing could be a tool to help manage or to help resolve inequities and detect them? She said that these inequities come to light in all standardized measures and that we can address them, in her words, if we can see them. What do you make of that?
Standardized tests are themselves a barrier to access and equity. Schools that have gone test optional over the past 20 years have found an increase in diversity of all sorts, more talented young people from underrepresented minorities, eligible students, first-generation applicants, whose scores would have kept them out of those schools, have ended up applying and being admitted. The truth is that there's plenty of evidence, not promotional theory, to contradict their argument. When schools go test optional, generally they get more applicants, they get better academically qualified applicants, and they get more diversity of all sorts: Black, brown, first-gen, low income.
Can you explain that a little bit more for people who maybe have not had to deal with a standardized test in a really long time? Talk about that link. How do we know that standardized tests are keeping students of color or students from disadvantaged backgrounds out?
Well, we know that there is a strong link between test scores and family income, that affluent families on average score substantially higher than poor families. Part of that is due to differential access to high-priced, high-quality test prep courses, which changing the test to a computerized form won't address at all. And there are other built-in flaws in this testing system, which the test makers themselves have admitted underestimates the college capacity for young women, for kids whose home language is not English, and for older applicants to college. Those three groups are more than half of all kids on college campuses nowadays. The test is simply not necessary and presents an unfair barrier to access. Even before the pandemic, nearly 1,100 schools, including extremely competitive institutions like the University of Chicago or Bates or Brandeis, were test optional, and it worked well for them, increased the mix on their campuses, and didn't undermine academic quality in any way.
So can I just be clear about what your organization is advocating? Are you saying that all standardized tests are inherently bad, or that there are better ways to do standardized testing? I mean, what if, I'm from a university that still wants some kind of an instrument to help sort out students in the admissions process, just not the SAT or the ACT? Would that be okay, or are you anti all standardized tests?
That instrument already exists, and it's called High School Record. And research both by independent experts, by colleges, and the test makers themselves shows that High School Record is a stronger predictor of academic tests than any 3-hour test. I mean, you learn
don't you
more
run into
about
the
an
same
applicant.
problem? But forgive me, Mr. Schaefer. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but don't you run into a version of the same problem? I mean, if social inequities and economic inequities disadvantage me at taking the SAT, they probably disadvantage me at taking every other test in high school, too. So how is one better than the other?
Actually, the gaps are much smaller on high school grades and class rank and other measures like that, so that a young person who does well in high school but does not so well on the test is a very strong candidate for success in college, because they've demonstrated their capacity to do academic work in a classroom setting, not filling in bubbles on a Saturday morning, which is what the test, whether it's on computer or pencil and paper, measures. It's not an accurate assessment of what one can do in college. And that's why now 1,800 schools, nearly 80% of all colleges, are not requiring test scores. They're doing it based on evidence and data, not the promotions of $1 billion a year industry that makes its money selling tests.
I wonder also, before I have to let you go, what you make of the fact that even despite some of the concerns about these tests, even though you can apply to very strong top flight universities, UC universities, Harvard, and others, without taking it, many students still choose to take it. There was a dip during the pandemic. Looks like the College Board might close that gap to the pre-pandemic numbers, depending on what students decide to do. Even with all this evidence, many kids still decide to take the SAT. What do you make of that before we go?
Well, partly it's a transitional issue. It's just social change. But beyond that, the common application, which is what many students use to apply, shows that barely half of all applicants choose to submit test scores. Test optional admissions empowers young people. It's a win-win both for applicants and for admissions officers. And
but Mr. Schaefer, I'm asking you before the interview is over, I'm asking you about the kids who choose to take the test, who say, I'm going to take the SAT because I think I can get a great score on it and I believe it will bolster my chances. For those who still say, I want to take it anyway, I'm trying to get your reaction to that.
And that's what test optional admissions means. Test optional admissions retains the ability of students who want to apply with test scores to do just that. But it gives the power to the student to determine whether that test score will be seen as part of the application and whether it truly reflects their capacity to pursue higher education and do well.
I'm hearing some overlap from you and the College Board in terms of the option, that students should have the option to be able to take the test. She did express support for that as well in our conversation, and I appreciate you making time for this conversation. Bob Schaefer, the Executive Director of Fair Test, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Neil
Joshua.
Young has pulled his music off Spotify in protest of the app's marquee star Joe Rogan. What does this dispute tell us about the streaming music industry? And how do musical artists get paid anyway? We'll tell you before we go. So when was the last time you bought a CD? What about a vinyl record? For many of us, it's been a while. The way we listen to our favorite songs has changed a lot since Steve Jobs pulled that first iPhone out of his pocket. Streaming music apps like Spotify, Pandora, and Apple Music dominate the industry now. But how is this shift affecting the artists who make the music we love? For some, like Billie Eilish, the world of streaming unlocked a fast track to stardom. For many others, it's presented an array of issues around pay, ownership, and even ideology. Yesterday, Neil Young pulled all his music off Spotify. He says he did so in response to vaccine misinformation on the podcast The Joe Rogan Experience. This podcast is by far one of the top shows online and a huge draw to Spotify. An estimated 11 million people listen to each episode. Some episodes are 3 or 4 hours long, if not longer. And Spotify accounts for nearly a third of all global streaming music subscribers. So this is not a small move for Neil Young to make. Joining us now is Ann Powers, music critic and correspondent for NPR. Ms. Powers, welcome. Good to talk to you again.
Hey, good to see you.
What do you think the impact of this decision is going to be? I mean, Spotify released a statement saying that they're sad to see him go and they'd like to have him back, but I don't think they're going to, lose a percentage of their profits because Neil Young is not on there anymore. How does this play out?
Well, that's a great question, Joshua, because it could play out in a lot of different ways depending on how other people respond to Neil Young's action. This protest is really... it's not about, how much an artist gets paid on Spotify or, the kinds of protests that have happened or attempts to raise awareness about streaming in the past. This is a protest that's more like a boycott of a place. Like, for example, if you remember in the 80s when many musicians decided not to play in South Africa because they were supporting the anti-apartheid movement. Basically, Neil Young is treating Spotify like South Africa. He's saying, I don't want to participate in a place that has, that represents politics and things I don't believe in. Will others stand with his cause? I think we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Let's talk about the business of these streaming apps, for example. Let's say that I, had a band, Joshua Johnson and the Journalists, and my big hit song, Baby Don't Break My Deadline, is tearing up the charts. Everybody wants to hear Baby Don't Break My Deadline. It goes on Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, Pandora. How do I get paid? Walk me through that process.
Right, so you're going to get paid on Spotify through something called a pro rata basis, which means every stream, every subscription, every bit of money that goes into Spotify is divided all in a giant pot for all the artists. So what that means is that if you are, Joshua Johnson is the equivalent of The Weeknd, and your music is streamed about 5%, say, of everything on Spotify, you're going to make a lot of money. But if you're Ann Powers and the esoteric music critics, and you have a really devoted following, of 100,000 people or something, the money you would have made selling directly to them, or even selling through a record store, or selling through, remember Downloads? Or a platform like Bandcamp that still lets artists sell directly to their fans, you're going to make a lot more money that way. So that's the problem that a lot of people have with these streaming services, is that it really favors what we'll have to call the 1%.
I know I'd love to talk more about this, but before I have to let you go, it seems like even as this has created problems for some artists, it's also created opportunities. Like some of them have been able to get better information on who shows up at their shows or have other podcasts or merch. And so in some ways, for some artists, it's allowed them to be entrepreneurial, but it's forced them to learn how to be entrepreneurial.
Well, this has always been true in the music industry. And frankly, artists have always been tragically at the bottom of the food chain within the music industry in many ways. Artists have always had to fight for their own rights, their own ability to make money, and that's what happens when you're working in corporate entertainment, I guess. I mean, independent support of your favorite artist is important. Go out and buy that T-shirt, buy the vinyl, don't go to the show necessarily, but give them $10 on their Patreon. There's lots of ways to support artists.
NPR music critic Ann Powers, who I will note is the author of one of my favorite books about music called Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music. Ann, good to talk to you again. Thank you very much.
Great to see you.
And thank you for making time for us. Please come back tomorrow and do bring a friend. Be sure to follow us online for the latest on upcoming topics and guests. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. So until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.